All right. Good morning, everybody. Oh, I have to move my microphone thing here. It's like it was up by my eye. It was going to drive me insane, and that's a short drive for me. So it's good to see everybody here today. Once again, we have beautiful weekend weather for the autumn. Couldn't have it all summer, but it's nice that we can have it in September, right? Great to see you all. And we are finishing up. I really thought we would finish up Hosea last week, but we are finishing up this week. We should finish up. We have 3 questions to go. So we're on the last page. And we're going to open up with a word of prayer. Father, thank you very, very much for today. Thank you for the opportunity we have to get together and spend time in your word, come before you as brothers and sisters and folks that are seeking after you. We ask, God, that you would keep your hands upon us today. We pray for your wisdom. We thank you for your loving kindness. In Jesus' great name we pray. Amen. All right, so we were missing a bunch of folks last week because our ladies, many of our ladies went on our retreat to Camp Berea, so they missed a little bit. But we had I don't know, maybe they sat down this week and watched last week's Sunday school class. I have my doubts, but maybe they did. We are, but we're able to pick up this week. We're going to be in Hosea 14, and so was it 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago? We started with Hosea, and we worked through most of the narrative section in Hosea, and then chapters 1 and 3 are kind of the narrative section. Chapter 2 is a bit more poetic, and then the last. Hang on, I'm doing my math. 11 chapters of Hosea are all poetic, like you expect to see in the prophetical books in the Old Testament. And we are looking at, and so we saw that God called, just for means of catch up, God called Hosea to be a living symbol of his relationship with Israel. And can anybody remind us how he did that? Yeah. God literally called Hosea. It just didn't happen that Hosea happened to be a faithful husband to an adulterous wife, but God called Hosea to to marry an adulterous wife. And of course, and then as things play out, his wife has 3 children. One of them, it seems to be apparent, is Hosea's child. The second 2, there is question called into who their father is, just by the way that the passage is phrased. When Jezreel is born, his firstborn, or their firstborn, it says that she bore him a son. But then with the other 2 children, I can only remember their English names. I can never remember their Hebrew names well. Well, no, I can't. God tells Hosea to name the next 2 children, not my people and no mercy. And those 2 children, when they're each born, the passage says that Gomer conceived and bore a son, but it doesn't say that they conceived and bore a son. It changed, or a daughter. It changes the wording, or it didn't bear Hosea a child. It changes the wording, which calls into question who is the father of these children, particularly because the nature of the relationship was already called into question. And then Hosea chapter 2 becomes a plea, as it were, of Hosea pleading with his children to call their mother back. And chapter 3, Hosea goes and buys back his wife. His wife has apparently either been bought or sold herself off to another man. And Hosea goes and buys back his wife and says to her, "Come back and be with me, and you be faithful to me, and I will be faithful to you." And then the rest of the book is as I said before, is prophetic in that sense that it's in verse. It's written like poetry, which the prophets tend to do when they're writing. And we've seen how God is angry at Israel and why. And remember, Israel's the northern nation of at the time. And we have seen that God has promised redemption for his people. And now we come into Hosea chapter 14. So we're going to look at how God begins to talk about that redemption. We're at the very end of the book. And kind of what that means. So let's take a little peek at Hosea chapter 14. So we're going to look at verses 4 through 7. Remembering, we're not looking to dive deep into every book and understand what every book is about. What we're looking for is to see examples of how God spoke to people, and then ask ourselves, is this a way that God could speak to us today so that we can better hear God's voice? And so just as a quick aside, I relate this to when I was in college. I wasn't, I didn't have a lot of expendable income. I was making like $70 a week or something like that between doing a youth ministry job and doing lawn mowing for this lady in the community. And that was what I was making. And I drove in 1978 Caprice Classic. Right. So where most of that $70 went. Right? It was like I worked in order to I had a car so that I could work. And then I worked in order to keep the car on the road. Right. That was basically the way of it. And so I found a little hobby by the end of my time in college and going into seminary. I found a hobby that I could do, something that I could do that would occupy my time that wasn't very expensive. And it was bird watching. If you have a pair of binoculars and a bird book, you can bird watch. And I got both of those things as gifts for Christmas because I started being interested in bird watching. And I could go anywhere on campus. I could go out into the woods. I could go wherever I went. I started bird watching. And before I started bird watching, I just saw brown birds and black and white birds and yellow birds. And I heard sounds. But as I began to bird watch, I noticed that those black and white birds, some of them were chickadees, some of them were nuthatches, some of them were black and white warblers, some of them were downy woodpeckers, some of them were hairy woodpeckers. They were different sized, they were different shaped. The same thing with the yellow birds or the brown birds. I started to see variety that I didn't know that was there before. And then even when I heard a sound, I could say, wait a second, I just heard something. And in the whole cacophony, say, of walking through the woods where you hear all these birds, I'd say, wait a second, that's a call I don't recognize. And I could tune my ear into hearing that call. And that's kind of what I hope that we're going to be able to do by studying how God speaks to his people through the Bible, that we'll be able to hear the voice of God better. We'll know what to listen for when we're seeking or when God's speaking to us. Does that make sense? Cool. So Hosea chapter 14, verses 4 through 7. I will heal their apostasy. I will love them freely, for my anger has turned from them. I will be like the dew to Israel. He shall blossom like the lily. He shall take root like the trees of Lebanon. His shoots shall spread out. His beauty shall be like the olive, and his fragrance like Lebanon. They shall return and dwell beneath my shadow. They shall flourish like the grain. They shall blossom like the vine. Their fame shall be like the wine of Lebanon. So, what does God promise to the people of Israel? Yeah, if you return to me, I'll help you grow and put down roots. Can anybody remember what God's original covenant was to the nation of Israel. If they were faithful to him, then what? They would live in the promised land. How? Peacefully and long term. Specifically, right? God says to them, if you are faithful to me, if you keep my covenant and my decrees, then your crops will grow. You will not have famine. Your flocks and your herds will increase. Your wives even will not have stillborn babies or miscarried babies. Furthermore, he says, I will protect your borders. And like I love to talk about, this is kind of wild if you think about this. Israel, when they were originally called, kept no military. They had a militia, right? So a militia was basically everybody from, I think it was aged 20 to 60, but it might have been 20 to 40, that was not newly married, served in the militia. And so you're at home, you're doing your regular thing, and then you hear the bell or you see the fire or whatever, that you'd hear the horn blow. You'd run home, you'd grab whatever you had for weapons, which might be farm implements, and then go out and prepare to defend your community. That's what a militia does. And God didn't tell them to have a standing army. He says, have this militia to stand against armies when they attack you. And God called them to have a 6-day week. So they had 1 day a week, even on into the time when they had kings. When they did have a standing army, they had 1 day a week that they were required to rest. You could not show up for work 1 day a week. And God didn't stagger that day a week out by like alphabetical order for family names or whatever. Or if you were born this half of the week, this is your day off, and that half of the week, this is your day off. All the people of Israel were supposed to take the same day off. They all were supposed to take Saturday off, rest on Saturday. And there's no account in the Bible where the enemies of God's people said, I got a good idea. Let's go attack Israel on Saturday. I heard everybody takes the day off and they're not allowed to work. And the people of Israel just won't be prepared. They won't have anybody in their guard towers. They won't have any soldiers on duty. Let's go get them then. God clouds the minds of God's people's enemies so that they don't attack on the Sabbath. God promises not just to give them fertile lands and fertile families and crops and herds and all that stuff, but he also promises to protect their borders, right down to the point that God says to them, when your enemies attack, I will chase them out with the bee and the hornet, or the wasp and the hornet, right? Like send them flying because they have stinging insects under their armor that they can't get out. That's what he promises them. It's incredible. Look what he says here. What's he saying? I will. Yeah. Yes, I'm going to heal you, right? It's not like once you get it all together. It's basic. It's like I equate it to if we were to look at Hosea as the example. Hosea shows up at this other man's home and says, I'm going to buy my wife back from you. What's the cost? And he looks, and almost like he looks at her and says, if you come with me. And she's looking at the other man, and she's looking at Hosea, and knows that her life with Hosea was way better than any man that he could buy her from, right? And starts to walk towards him. And Hosea says, I will be faithful to you. Just be faithful to me. And she keeps on walking towards him. Like, if God's people will just walk towards him, he will heal them. He knows they can't fix it. We're talking about that a little. We've been talking about that in the sermon, right? They can't fix it. God can fix it. What else does he promise them? Free love. I will love them freely. Yeah. Make them beautiful. Nice. Hmm. Turn his anger away. I mean, think about that. Make her beautiful, right? Make them beautiful. It seems maybe not quite evident from the text, but I think we can probably pretty accurately infer that everybody knew what Gomer was doing, right? Just like all the nations around Israel know that Israel's not being faithful to their God. And how you would almost think in that situation, were Gomer to come back, have a change of heart, and come back to Hosea, she would probably hang her head for the rest of her life, right? Embarrassed for who she was and how she'd harmed her husband. But God says, I'm going to make you beautiful. You won't hang your head around me. I'm going to lift you up. Yep. Yeah. Right. Yeah. His fame will be known like the wine of Lebanon and et cetera. Yeah. He'll be known in a good way. And so thinking about that, like in the terms of Hosea and Gomer, just that she's going to be recognized and liked, maybe. Um, it's funny how women have been answering a lot of these questions, and you guys are all seeing different things than I'm seeing. Right? It's kind of neat, right? Because I think we just put ourselves in different positions, and that's okay. The thing that I'm seeing here is that God offers Israel a do-over, a restart. He not only does he say, let's pick up, let's get this relationship going again. It's let's pick up, get this relationship going again without the hurt from before it. Let's start as if we start from the moment that I betrothed you, that I married you. God uses betrothal and marriage language when he calls Israel. Excuse me. Let's start right from there, like wedding day, when I told you I would love you and I would protect you and I would care for you and I would bring you bounty and all that. And let's forget all this hurt that's happened. And let me start with you afresh as if it's still our wedding day. Isn't that cool? He gives them he basically recapitulates, he restates the initial promises. It's worded differently, but the theme is the same. The initial promises that he gave to Israel, he gives to Israel again. In hopes, because Israel doesn't come back to the Lord. In hope, he's saying, if you come back to me, this is how it'll be. It's pretty cool. Really pretty cool. Um, so, well, we got that. I guess I stomped all over that. How does Hosea's living parable relate to Israel, right? We got that. But how does it relate to the church? And how does it relate to you? And I wasn't sure if I was using big C church or little C church. So you can decide. How does it relate to the church? Yeah, I think that's really good, Hillary. I think so. When we say, I got to remember which way I'm facing. All right, this way. All right, I had to like, how would I write church this way? So if we're talking small C church, what we mean is like individual church buildings, individual denominations, things like that, right? That's what we kind of mean when we say small C church. When we say capital C church, we mean the whole, all of Christianity, not just today, but also stretching all the way back in history and then forward as far as it will go. We don't know, right? Um, and the reformers, particularly John Calvin, called and also he picked that up from, I learned just this week, he picked that up from Augustine, right? So Augustine in like the 400s, 300s, 400s was talking about the invisible church. Augustine recognized when he talked about the invisible church versus the visible church. The visible church are the people you see on Sundays. Everywhere you go, wherever you see a church that professes to be Christian church, that is part of the visible church. It's what we see. What we can't, Peter Brady there. What we can't determine is what the invisible church is. The invisible church is the population within the visible church that is actually faithful to Christ. We can't determine that. And sometimes whole denominations can be off the charts. I just watched a video a couple weeks ago. There's this YouTube channel I started watching somewhere this summer called Ready to Harvest. The guy he sort of lectures. He's not very exciting, but he's very informative. And younger guy, and he basically just talks about different denominations, different churches, different movements. He compares and contrasts sometimes. Other times he talks about smaller groups that people might not understand. Um, really, really neat to listen to. And oops, I'm one coffee down this morning. I was talking about Ready to Harvest. I was talking about the church. Oh well, I derailed my own self, telling you guys where I got my information. I'm trying to provide a footnote. So bad. It only gets worse, right? It's the second thing to go. But in talking about the invisible church, we can't determine what the invisible church is. The invisible church has always existed, but it's the invisible church that is actually the faithful church to God. And God is always calling for those that are part of the visible church, but not part of the invisible church, to be faithful and to come back. Oh, now I remember. I watched a video about, I knew it would come back. The train leaves the station, the train comes back, and I got to not derail myself again, right? The video was about this pastor in the church in Canada. The church in Canada is like equivalent to our mainline denominations, and the Canadian church, Canadian United Canadian Church, has full, I think it's called full fellowship with most of our mainline denominations, the PCUSA, the UCC, the UMC, I think our own denomination, the ABC. And what that means is that if a person has ordination credentials within one denomination, they can be hired within one of the other denominations without any significant excess paperwork to become a pastor within that denomination. So in a denomination in Canada, in the mainline denomination in Canada, there is a female pastor who openly professes that she is an atheist. She does not believe in God at all, but serves as a pastor, has not been removed from leadership by the denomination or by the church she pastors. And you're wondering, yeah, but how? And I have no idea. But if your concern is faithfulness to God, then you'd want to see a pastor leading your church who is concerned about being faithful to God and serving him, right? But if your concern is not that, then who knows what you might ask for, what you might want. And in such places, God is calling the visible church, what to all the people on the outside would look and say, It's a church. It's built roughly triangular shape. It has a steeple with maybe a bell in it. There are a bunch of rows of seating inside for people to come and sing old songs. There's colored glass in the window, maybe with pictures in it, or whatever. It looks like a church. That's the visible church. And the call to the visible church is always be the invisible church. And if you are the invisible church, because we can't tell who's who with human eyes, then God will call us back, right, to that deep, intimate relationship that He initially called us to. He'll bring it right to us, which also we'll kind of be talking about today in the message. Yes. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. So Janice just points out that Jesus tells parables that line up with what I was just talking about, most particularly like the wheat and the tares, where or wheat and the weeds, sometimes it's called, the enemy, it says, goes into the farmer's field or the landowner's field, and he sows weeds among the wheat, and then it all grows up, um, the servants come back to their master and say, "What do we do? All these tares, all these weeds have grown up among the wheat. Should we go pull it out?" And the landowner says, "If you go pull it out, you're also going to pull out the wheat. So leave it, and we'll sort it out at the harvest. Let them both grow," he says. And the idea being that we can't determine, and possibly by trying to root it out ourselves, we can cause harm to those that believe. And so we leave it. But at times you can find that the church is swayed more by those that don't believe or that aren't faithful than it is by those who are faithful. And then at other times it's swerved or by those that are faithful. Thank you, Janice. And how does so? Huh? Taught the me and my spelling mistakes. So how does this promise from God and restoring His love to Israel? How does it relate to you? Yeah. So on at first blush, I would say I'm looking for something a little else, but you're right. He buys us back with Christ. He has redeemed humanity with Christ. That is, and that's what you're saying. No, you can't. Mhm. Right. 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 So yeah, so it does appear the text seems to intimate that that Gomer comes back to Hosea and they live happily ever after. He buys her back. And I was thinking about for the Christian who strays, right? Because let's face it, right? Like Gomer, well, maybe let's not face it, right? Gomer may not have been raised in any kind of faithful Israelite household since most of the northern kingdom was completely apostate. But let's, for kicks and giggles, say that Gomer was raised in a faithful Israelite household and then wanders not only from her husband, but also from faithful Judaism. Believers wander, right? Solid Christian men and women who give their lives to the Lord can fall away. They can have breakdowns. They can come into all kinds of stress and who knows what, that they shipwreck their own faith, but not always to destruction, right? What happens if after a year, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 50 years, you realize that you've blown it with the Lord and he still wants you back? Won't let anyone slip from his hand. Yeah. Waits for you to come back. Good shepherd, right? Say again. Say that again. Yes. Yep. There may be consequences, but he will take you back. Yes, Andy? Mm. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's when it's with God's forgiveness to us is not reluctant like our forgiveness sometimes is to other people. Janice? Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Yeah. When God makes us aware of our sin, he's not like kicking dirt on our faces when he does it, right? It lifts us up when we repent. And if we go, well, I'll show you God, well then not so much, right? But he shows us our sin. We're like, oh, if you're right, we repent and we're like on a new level with him, right? He's not like, look what rotten thing you did and kicking stuff at us. The amazing thing about walking with the Lord is that when he calls us to forgiveness, and when we repent and come back to him, we come right back to where we left off, maybe even a little deeper, right? Maybe even a little closer. It's so different from everything else in our life. I've been struggling for the last little bit with injury, and I was a long distance runner. I loved it. It was the best thing that had happened to me in a long time. And then in the last 2 years, I keep on re-injuring myself in various ways. And now it's like 9 weeks since I've run at all. And I know that that means that I am not going to be able to go out when I can start running again and drop right into a 10-mile run or drop right into a half marathon and be able to do that. It's going to take me months to get back any significant distance. It could take me years to get back to where I was 3 or 4 years ago, and I'm 52 years old. So the likelihood of getting back to where I was 3 or 4 years ago is really, 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 like, really this paper thin slim. It's not gonna happen. I am never gonna get back to where I was. And that is how it is with so many things. If we let our training go in the field that we're in, right? Imagine if you work in the technical field and you take a couple years off from working in the technical field because you decide to take an early retirement. And then you realize the early retirement isn't working out and you need to go back to work. What's going to have happened in those couple of years in the technical field? You're going to be way behind, right? You are never going to have the job you had before. You should have stuck with it, kind of thing, right? I've lost it. That's how you're going to feel because you haven't kept up with it. Everything's changed. It's like that physically. It's like that within many careers, that the changes that happen so fast you can't keep up with them. But with God, God says, "You come back to me, and you're back." That's really pretty cool. Really pretty cool. All right, let's look at 14:8. So he says, "Oh, Ephraim, Ephraim is a way to refer to Israel, to the northern kingdom of Israel. Ephraim was one of the tribes of Israel to do with idols. It is I who answer and look after you. I am like an evergreen cypress. From me comes your fruit." So before we ask the first question, we'll ask a first question, the parenthetical first question. What were the idols that Israel pursued? Statue of the bull. That's the big one, and I think that's the one that he's talking about. I mean, you could carry in practically any of the idols from the nations around them or that had existed in the land before it was conquered under Joshua, book of Joshua, right? And the book of Judges. You could pull in any of those false gods as well because they continued to worship a lot of those false gods. But I think that the one that he's really talking about, or the ones he's really talking about, are those bulls that the first king of Israel, Jeroboam the first, made to keep people from going down to Jerusalem to worship Yahweh. He made two bulls, but one at the northern part of the nation, one at the southern part of the nation, and said, this is the Lord your God, right? This is Yahweh. He says, this is Yahweh who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. God says, you make no idols of me. None, zero. Says that in the 10 Commandments. No idols. And it's not like you don't make idols of other gods. You don't make an idol to represent me. Some of our brothers and sisters in Christ within the Presbyterian church and other Reformed churches will not watch a movie about Jesus. Did you know that? They won't watch a movie about Jesus because Jesus is God. And if they sit down in the privacy of their living room and watch a movie about Jesus and they see that man playing Jesus and should accidentally in their prayer think that that's what Jesus looks like, they've made that an idol by picturing that form. And so they won't do it. They won't have pictures of Jesus in their homes. Isn't that something? I mean, for many of us, that might be a little bit of a step out there. But by the same token, you go, whoa, what would happen if I picture the guy playing Jesus in The Chosen, if I'm praying and that's what I picture? Is that an idol? Or, when you see, it's funny, isn't it funny how we all know what Jesus looks like? Right? Oh yeah, he's a slightly darker skinned man than the average Englishman, with beautiful, like Surge-worthy, but brown hair, right? Just gorgeous, just the right length, nice full beard that Pastor Bill could never grow, and piercing blue eyes. That's what Jesus looks like, right? Like that's what we picture. Well, have we made that an idol, right? By picturing that that's what Jesus looks like. I don't know. I just like avoid picturing to unless he's given me an image somehow. I would avoid picturing. I sure, I wouldn't carve it. I won't bow down to it. Um, yeah, the idols that he's probably talking about are those golden bulls. What idols do we pursue? All the stuff we want? Yeah, to one degree or another. Yeah. We can put appreciation, we can make appreciation an idol, we can make love an idol, we can make respect an idol, make the church an idol. Hmm. Turn the church building into an idol. Turn our Bibles into an idol. Turn our kids into an idol. Anything that takes the place of God in our lives. When I first came here to our church, we had some folks in the church who um, were mad at me. They looked into my office, and I had my Bible on my desk, and I had something else sitting on top of my Bible. And the person said, "You never, ever put anything on top of the Bible." And I said, "What? Ever? Why?" "Well, because it's the word of the Lord." But yeah, okay, I got it, but it just did not compute. Like I could not make it compute in my head because it's just a Bible. And I'm like literally thinking, well, what if I have two? You grew up with that? Yeah. Yeah, so Sandy's saying that she grew up with that, and now she doesn't hold to that any longer, but she has this instinct when she puts her Bible down and she puts something on top of it to want to shuffle it back to the top. We can make the Bible into an idol. Translations of the Bible can be made into an idol. That's a definite thing that we see, especially in the United States. I don't know about it anywhere else, but definitely so in the United States. I had um, a guy that was in the church where I was led to Christ who announced I don't know why. Something came up and he was angry about it. And he announced in the middle of the worship service that he would not do anything in private that he would not do in the church. And I looked at his 5 children and I thought that man should not have a key. Right? Like he'd made like his own his own life sort of like this, almost like an idol. Like he was trying to be like, it was like that holier than thou kind of thing. And we can make our own lives an idol. We can make our spouses an idol, our education, anything we put in that place in our lives that God ought to occupy, even when we think it's something about God, which is screwy. So, how can idols not answer us? He says, um, "O Ephraim, what have I to do with idols? It is I who answer you and look after you," which means that he's responding to the fact that the people believed that it was the idols that they were worshiping that were responding to them and that were caring for them. In the ancient world, you bribed your gods. Outside of Judaism, you bribed your gods. You made them food. You brought it and you placed it before the idol. You fed them, um, and because that way they do good things for you. How do idols not answer us? They can't bring us into a relationship with God. think one of the scary things about idols is that if you give yourself over fully to something, that's just what you'll get. Does that make sense? If you give yourself fully over to gaining wealth, that's what you'll get. Think about how many songs there are, whether it's rock and roll or country or even in Christian music, about the dad who gives himself to his job. And what does he have when his kids have grown up? He's got his job. And that's what he has. You give yourself over to pursuing fame, you might have it on whatever level you are able to achieve it. And that's all you'll have. It can't answer you. Sorry? Oh, sure, music can big time be an idol. Yep. The kind of music we sing in worship can be an idol. Mm-hmm. Big time. So what must we have instead of idols? This is an easy one. I stumped you. Because you're like, it can't be this easy. He's digging for something hard. Relationship with God and a relationship with God alone. That's it. Start there. Him number one. And let everything else fall into place. All right, last verse that we're going to look at, and also the last verse in Hosea, verse 9. Whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know them. For the ways of the Lord are right, and the upright walk in them, but transgressors stumble in them. What does this make you think of anything? That verse? Proverbs? What, anything particular about Proverbs? Mm-hmm. Come on, Bill. Yep. I was thinking of Psalm 1. You are also thinking of Psalm 1. No, she says now. Just want to point that out. Right. It says, blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water that yield its fruit in season, and its leaf does not wither. In all he does, he prospers. The wicked are not so, but are like the chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. And when I read that verse, this verse 9, bang, it was like Psalm 1 came knocking on my head. It's the theme is the same. And it's a theme that's over and over again in Scripture, that those who will seek to do the Lord's ways, that they walk in them. And it's not to say the walk's not hard. The walk can be hard. And it's not to say you won't trip and fall, because you will trip and fall. But the Lord will lift you up. However, those who are wicked trip on the things that are right. Does that make sense? It's the rightness of it that trips them up. It's the rightness of it that they cannot stand before, that causes them to fall down. So who does he say will heed his warnings? Oh, somebody drank my coffee. Who will heed Hosea's warnings? The righteous will heed God's warnings. Yeah. And how are the righteous perceived? Or how do they perceive? Maybe is the better word. What makes them righteous? wisdom, right? Where does wisdom start? Fear of the Lord. And so, he says the same thing twice, right? It's poetry. It's Hebrew poetry. They're not going to rhyme because rhyming's too easy in Hebrew, right? So they say the same thing twice. Whoever is wise, let him understand these things. Whoever is discerning, let him know them. It's the same statement. It's repeated twice. That's how Hebrew poetry often is. Um, and then who will not heed his warnings? The rebellious, the transgressors, and if it's the wise who are if it is the wise who are righteous, then what about the transgressors or the rebellious? What are they? They're foolish. It's just like reading Proverbs all over again, like Sandy said. That you're looking at the same kind of paradigm that you see over and over again. Any other comments about Hosea? Comments, queries, conundrums, concerns. What was my last one? I came up with a new one. Considerations. Janice was very happy when I came up with another C. Although queries doesn't begin with C. Questions doesn't either. Yeah, you're right. I was spelling it CW this whole time. You nailed it. It's the sound, not the letter. All right, no other comments? I really thought that this one would get us going. I don't know how many people were familiar with Hosea before we dove into it. It's kind of one of those more out there books with the way that God calls Hosea. When we started, we talked about some of the wild stuff that God had called the major prophets to, and that stuff was wild. And then you get to this, and you're like, yeah, I'll walk around naked for 2 years. That sounds better, right? Rough. All right, we're going to turn a page, or maybe not even turn a page. Maybe you're going to look across the page, and we're going to start the prophet Joel. Joel is a pretty neat prophet. Joel, I have a little introduction for us here, as I've tried to do for most of the books. So Joel is a difficult prophet to date, not because he always says no. All right, one person got my dad joke right there. All right, some date him during the 9th century BC, making him a contemporary of the prophet Elisha, and therefore the first of the writing prophets. Because remember, we talked about the difference between the writing prophets and the non-writing prophets, that the non-writing prophets all are kind of around that 1000 BC, kind of creeping their way into the first millennium BC. But as the time in the first millennium BC crept forward towards the year 0, the tendency of the kings of the land was to no longer send an emissary to go speak to a king, but to send an emissary to go speak to the people. And remember, we looked at that during the time of Hezekiah, that it was like the Rabshakeh and the Rabsharis and all these people were sent by Babylon. They were sent by Babylon to come and they were sent by the Assyrians. I'm sorry, they were sent by the Assyrians to come and confront Hezekiah. But they don't come and confront Hezekiah. They're speaking outside of the city of Jerusalem, and they're speaking to the people in Hebrew. And the leaders of the military of Jerusalem say, "Speak to us in Aramaic because we understand it," inferring that they don't want the people of Jerusalem to hear the threats that are being made against Jerusalem. Remember that? And that shows a shift in time, that there's a shift between what the kings and the nations were doing, and God said, okay, this is how communication has shifted. Well, God isn't like, oh no, communication has shifted. What shall I ever do? Right? But instead he looks and he says, okay, I am going to work with how the people understand communication. So that when the kings of the nations stop sending emissaries straight to a king to complain and say, look, you're going to get invaded and you're going to get it handed to you because you've been disobedient, God made the same. God shared in the shift. He made the same shift with them. And so way back on when we were talking about that, we talked about how God can speak to us through the same ways that we've changed media, because this is like a shift in media. And we've shifted media from, people having a town crier to having a letter posted on a billboard, down in the town square, to Morse code, to radio, to television. Now we have the interwebs and all that that we have made those shifts, and we've seen that God has not had his ability to communicate with us stymied through that. So possibility that Joel is the first of the writing prophets. Others place him during the 4th century BC, during the post-exilic return to Judah. Joel mentions the names of no kings and little about other nations, what his focus is, or better, what God's focus is, and is less political and more natural in his book. And you'll see what I mean by that. And so because of those things, they have a hard time nailing Joel down into what century he was preaching in. So he could be a contemporary of Elisha in the, what did I say, the 9th century? The 9th century, or he could be 400 years earlier or 500 years earlier in the 4th century. It's hard for them to say. But fortunately, we don't need to know the date in order to know the truth in this book. So let's look at Joel. We're going to read quite a bit of Joel. Joel is a 3-chapter book. So it says, I say it's quite a bit, but it's not really a whole heck of a lot. All right, so Joel chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. And you're looking at what is God saying to his people, why it's such a big deal. The word of the Lord came to Joel, the son of Pethuel. Hear this, you elders, give ear, all inhabitants of the land. Has such a thing happened in your days, or in the days of your fathers? Tell your children of it, and let your children tell their children, and their children to another generation. What the cutting locust left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust left, the hopping locust has eaten. And what the hopping locust left, the destroying locust has eaten. So, what has happened? An invasion of locusts. What are locusts? They're bugs. Anybody know what a locust looks like? It looks like a grasshopper, really big grasshopper. Like somewhere between like the size of your finger and the size of your hand, like lengthwise, something like that. A really big grasshopper. Sandy's freaking out. They're big, yeah. And what do? They fly and they eat. When do they fly? When they're moving to go eat something else. Yeah, that's it, right? They swarm in, and reports that I've read, they can darken the sky. They swarm in, they descend on your crops, they eat until your crops are gone, and then they fly on until they get somewhere else where there's something else to eat. Remember a couple of years ago, it was like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, the gypsy moth caterpillars were really bad around here. Remember that, right? And our deciduous trees were getting bare. And I shared how I remembered a time back in it might have been the late 70s or the early 80s. I was still in elementary school. I was in 4th grade. So I guess it was like 1981, something like that. I can remember the gypsy moth caterpillars in Massachusetts were so bad that they ate all the leaves off of the deciduous trees. Usually when I say all, I don't mean all. This time I mean every single leaf. And they moved on to the pine trees. They were like eating the needles off of the pine trees. They were so nasty. If you were walking down the street and there was a tree over your head, you'd feel the pitter patter on your body, not of the little bits of leaf that fell off when they were eating, but of their poop. It was disgusting. You'd see the sidewalk would just be like covered with the little speckles of their poop. It was gross. It's the closest thing I've ever come to a locust invasion. It's the closest thing I ever want to come to a locust swarm. It's disgusting. Why is this significant? Why is this locust swarm such a big deal? And you can get a hint to that in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 13 through 17. Deuteronomy 11, verses 13 through 17. So remember, Deuteronomy is the second telling. It is Moses, before he dies, reporting back to the people of Israel, reminding them of what God had done, from how he brought them out of Egypt and to the point that they were at on the edges of the Jordan River, preparing to go into the promised land. 13 to 17 says, "And if you will indeed obey my commandments that I command you today, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, he will give the rain for your land and its season, the early rain and the latter rain," or later rain, "that you may gather in your grain and your wine and your oil, and he will give grass in your fields for your livestock, and you shall eat and be full. Take care lest your heart be deceived and you turn aside and serve other gods to worship them. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will shut up the heavens so that there will be no rain, and the land will yield no fruit, and you will perish quickly off the good land that the Lord is giving you." So what happens when the locusts come through? How much do they eat? Everything. What does the passage even seem to say in Joel chapter 1, verses 1 through 4? He describes three different kinds of locusts, right? What the cutting locust has left, no, four. What the cutting locust has left, the swarming locust has eaten, right? So there should be nothing left. But you're like, oh, look, there's a sprig of green. What the swarming locust has left, the hopping locust has eaten. Oh, great. Now that's gone too. Oh, but look, there's one last little bit over there. And what the hopping locust has left, the destroying locust has eaten, right? It's like just upon. If there was anything left, it's gone. So what can we infer, or what do you think, why is this such a big deal that the locusts came through and they ate everything? What does God promise them? It shows that they haven't been faithful, right? If you're faithful, you're not going to lack anything to put into your barns. You're going to be able to fill up your barns, fill up your silos, whatever you might have, not only to feed yourself, but also to feed your flocks and your herds. And then as you read, kind of as God expands upon that promise, you know how God expands upon promises in the Bible, right? He tells you this is the basic promise, and here are some implications of it, and he keeps on building out, right? That they'd have so much that they could sell it to the other nations. Like if a famine hits the country next to you, don't worry, it's not going to hit you. You'll be able to sell what your excess is to that other nation, which means you'll be wealthy. I'm going to take care of you. So if locusts have come through and wiped out all the food that the people of Israel have, then the implication is they have not been faithful. And it ought to serve as a warning. Janice? I think that because you can't place him in time, I think it's probably very hard to. They so I am not sure which he is I didn't write it down, so it may have said something. hmm Yeah. Yeah, it's true. That the so where Janice points out is that if God is prophesying through Joel to the northern kingdom, that's exactly what happens. The northern kingdom in 7 722, I think it's 722 BC, gets utterly wiped out. Its people deported, and they don't come back. The remnant that's left of them either moves down to Judah and lives in Judah, or becomes assimilated with the group of people that are called the Samaritans. And the Samaritans are um, sort of those that were Israelites that were left over, and then another people group that was picked up from their nation and deposited into Israel, and they interbred and they maintained a form of Judaism. They had their own temple that they worshipped in. That, like when you read John chapter 4, and Jesus is speaking with the woman at the well, that kind of comes up a little bit. Right. Right. Yeah, that's when you hear about the lost tribes of Israel. They're talking about that, those basically 10 tribes that live there in the north. But elements of all those tribes moved down to the south and lived in Judah, most likely. Most of those tribes. So this is a big deal because this ought to be an indication to the people that they have been unfaithful. And God is basically trying to get their attention. All right, let's look at verses 5 through 7. Awake, you drunkards, and weep, and wail, all you drinkers of wine, because of the sweet wine, for it is cut off from your mouth. For a nation has come up against my land, powerful and beyond number. Its teeth are lion's teeth, and it has the fangs of a lioness. It has laid waste my vine and splintered my fig tree. It has stripped off their bark and thrown it down. Their branches are made white. So, what is God's call to his people and why? And we can go back to Deuteronomy 11 as well. Boy, come on, Deuteronomy 11. Thin pages. All right, so Deuteronomy 11, verses 22 to 25. For you, if you will be careful to do all this commandment that I commanded you to do, loving the Lord your God, walking in all his ways, and holding fast to them, then the Lord will drive out all these nations before you, and you will dispossess nations greater and mightier than you. Every place on which the sole of your foot treads shall be yours. Your territory shall be from the wilderness to the Lebanon, and from the river to the river Euphrates. From the river Euphrates to the western sea. No one shall be able to stand against you. The Lord your God will lay the fear of you and the dread of you on the land that you shall tread, as he promised you. So what God basically says to the people of Israel, if you could picture this in your noodle, he gives them a territory. He says, this will be your territory if you're faithful to me. The wilderness, which is the land that is wild, that is practically uninhabitable, between the southern borders of Israel and Egypt, to the Euphrates, right? The Euphrates River, like up in Iraq and running over to Turkey, Lebanon, which borders modern day Turkey, and then the Western Sea, which is the Mediterranean. He basically says, if you're faithful to me, you can have the Middle East. Can you picture that in your head, that map? So why are these, whoops, there's my paper. So why are these, or what's God's call to his people and why? What's he telling them to do or be aware of? Wake up. Why? Because the bad guys are coming. And why is it significant that the bad guys are coming and they need to wake up? They haven't been faithful. They've been drunkards, right? They're drinking away, trying to drink away their woes, maybe. It's either they're drinking away their woes or they're celebrating, right? And it's hard to say. And so if God's saying if you're celebrating, you have no reason to celebrate because what's coming? A big army, right? And if you've been miserable because, oh no, all the food is gone, well, wake up because there's a big army coming, right? No army would come and attack them. None would stand against them if they were faithful. So it's a second call for them to be aware of their faithlessness. Any other comments? We've gotten to the end of our time. We'll pick up next week in verse 8. Anyone else? Bueller? Janice? Yeah, could be. Yeah. Yeah, I think what he's saying is absolute destruction. Yeah, with the talk of the fig tree there. You strip the bark off a tree, it's dead. A splintered tree probably isn't coming back to life, right? it's pretty well done for. All right, let me close us with a word of prayer. Father, thank you very much for this morning and for the great chance to spend some time in your word and looking at some texts that are tricky and difficult, but that speak to us about the ways that you speak to your people. Lord, I pray that when you speak, we would hear you, we would know your call, and we would recognize your signs. We praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.